The death drive is one of the most confusing and dark aspects of psychoanalysis, but it is also one of the most important concepts in psychoanalysis. The concept began with Freud and then was built upon by Lacan and then Žižek, and remains a construction site for psychoanalysis today. What is this concept and what importance does it have for us as subjects? With these questions in mind, let's go to the beginning with Freud. The death drive as a concept first appeared in Freud's work, Beyond the Pleasure Principle. Freud came to the realization that all human behavior couldn't be explained by the pleasure principle, or what he would call the life drives, or otherwise known as eros, which are the drives that make us act in accordance with the idea of maximizing pleasure and minimizing pain. He came to this conclusion in clinical observations, where those with trauma would continue to revisit or recreate that trauma. There was something affecting the psyche beyond the pleasure principle. There exists in the mind a strong tendency towards the pleasure principle, but that tendency is opposed by certain other forces or circumstances, so that the final outcome cannot always be in harmony with the tendency towards pleasure. Freud conceptualized the death drive as unconscious and self-destructive. It may be seen at work in aggression, risky behavior, or reliving past trauma. The death drive does not work in favor of the pleasure principle. For instance, being aggressive in the name of revenge would be an attempt to gain pleasure, while the death drive would be aggression for the sake of aggression. The death drive pushes subjects to self-annihilation, to return to the inanimate non-life they once were. If we are to take it as truth that knows no exception, that everything living dies for internal reasons, becomes inorganic once again, then we shall be compelled to say that the aim of all life is death, and, looking backwards, that inanimate things existed before living ones. The attributes of life were at some time evoked in inanimate matter by the action of a force of whose nature we can form no conception. The tension which then arose in what had hitherto been inanimate substance endeavored to cancel itself out, and this way the first instinct came into being, the instinct to return to the inanimate state. This drive to Freud is the first drive, the one driving life itself. If this is to be the case, the primary aim of life would be death for life to return to non-life. Freud later expands this to say that the life drives found in the pleasure principle are subservient to the death drive, and only there to aid the organism to its death. Seen in this light, the theoretical importance of the instincts of self-preservation, of self-assertion, and of mastery greatly diminishes. There are component instincts whose function is to assure that the organism shall follow its own path to death, and to ward off any possible ways of returning to inorganic existence other than those which are immanent in the organism itself. If even the life instincts or drives are trying to bring us to our end, what then is life? From a Freudian perspective, life is an accident that happens to the inanimate. It is not simply the opposite of the inanimate, but a disturbance within it. We as life are nothing more than the perversions of the inanimate itself. In What is Sex by Alenka Zupančič, she describes it as such. Life is but a dream of the inanimate. More precisely, it is a nightmare of the inanimate, its nightmarish disturbance. Since the inanimate wants nothing but to be left alone, in this sense, we could say that the death drive is not so much a drive as an ontological fatigue, as a fundamental affect of life. Not that it is necessarily experienced, felt as fatigue, it is present as a kind of objective affect of life. Now you may be a bit confused, as was I. If the life drives that stem from the pleasure principle act in accordance with the death drive, to help support it in its goal of returning to the inanimate, then what makes the pleasure principle pleasurable, or much different than the death drive itself? Let's take a look back at how Freud describes the pleasure principle. In the theory of psychoanalysis, we have no hesitation in assuming that the course taken by mental events is automatically regulated by the pleasure principle. We believe, that is to say, that the course of those events is invariably set in motion by an unpleasurable tension. and that it takes direction such that its final outcome coincides with a lowering of that tension, that is, with an avoidance of unpleasure or a production of pleasure. We have decided to relate pleasure and unpleasure to the quantity of excitation that is present in the mind but is not in any way bound, and to relate them in such a manner that the unpleasure corresponds to an increase in the quantity of excitation and pleasure to a diminution. We can see here that the pleasure principle isn't what it is initially thought to be, or what we stated at the beginning of this video. From here, we can see that the pleasure principle is seeking relief from tension and excitation to return to a homeostatic state, the same way the death drive wants to bring us back to homeostasis, to take us from the tension of life and return us to the inanimate. In this precise sense, and as paradoxical as it may sound, the death drive as first introduced by Freud is in fact simply another name for the pleasure principle. If this is the case, if the ultimate pleasure is the ceasing of being, what then prevents us from attaining that pleasure now? Freud would say it'd be the ego's instincts for self-preservation, what he would call the reality principle. Under the influence of the ego's instincts of self-preservation, the pleasure principle is replaced by the reality principle. This latter principle does not abandon the intention of ultimately obtaining pleasure, but it nevertheless demands and carries into effect the postponement of satisfaction. The reality principle is not opposed to the pleasure principle or the death drive, but instead is the postponement of the pleasure derived from these drives, detouring around our inevitable return to the inanimate. We are now returned to the initial problem Freud had, and the reason for the conception of the death drive. If we end here, we did not find what was affecting the psyche beyond the pleasure principle, as we have discovered that the death drive and the pleasure principle are one and the same. If the death drive's goal is to be rid of tension and excitation, what is it in our psyche that pursues this tension and excitation? This is where Freud introduces the sexual drives. These drives are the only drives to break out of the cycle of life and death and feed on the tension and excitation. And on a biological level, the reason for the endless continuation of life. These drives don't simply fight against the pleasure principle, but as Zupančič puts it, sexual drives do not so much go against the pleasure principle as they seem to suspend it, invalidate it as a principle in the first place. They seem to be anti-fatigue and to have a driving force and logic of their own. It is very important that we keep in mind that this is not simply a driving force of life, but of something singular taking place within life. This movement in Freud's work creates what he calls a dualistic view between the sexual drives and the death drives, where the death drive tries to return us to the inanimate and the sexual drives depart from this destination and move in a different direction, a direction that creates something new and even establishes a potential immortality of the species. However, this dualistic view doesn't really work for Freud, because sexuality isn't as simple as continuing life. There is more to the dimension of sexuality. Sexuality cannot be completely separated from biological functions, nor can it be reduced to them. Within Freud's thought, sexuality is not a specific domain of human life, but instead inhabits all the domains of human life. From here, we move to Freud's hypothesis that in actuality, that there are only sexual drives, that all drives are sexual. We move from the dominating drive being the death drive to the dominating drive being the sexual drives. The sexual drives function as a singularity of antagonism, contradiction, or split. In a way, we can see the sexual drive subsuming the roles seen within the death drive. There's a contradiction or split in the foundation of the sexual drives themselves, which does not exist within the death drive, which allow it to take into account the actions of the death drive. What is this split? It is the repeated reproduction of the split between life and death. For the sexual drives, death is inherent to life and conditions its perpetuation. Freud says we can see this on the cellular level and of that of the individual involved in reproduction. With this split, the sexual drives are the only thing driving us towards somewhere beyond the return to the inanimate, tensionless existence. The sexual drives drive us in any meaningful sense of the word. Lacan later affirms this relationship between life and death and the sexual drives, stating, "We know that sexual division, insofar as it reigns over most living beings, is that which ensures the survival of a species. Let us say that the species survives in the form of its individuals. Nevertheless, the survival of the horse as a species has a meaning. Each horse is transitory and dies, so you see the link between sex and death. Sex and the death of the individual is fundamental." With this split, we are approaching Lacan's conception of the death drive. For Freud, there was only the sexual drives. However, in Lacan, every drive is virtually a death drive. The difference between Freud and Lacan with this split is that Freud saw the sexual drives dominating all, subsuming everything under their control, while Lacan believed that death itself is what is lurking within the sexual drives, not as their aim, but as a negative magnitude or minus implied in them, and repeated by them. To fully understand what Lacan means by this, we must return to how Freud conceptualized the instincts of self-preservation. These instincts repeat in a circular path towards death. Remember, the instincts of self-preservation did not fight against the death drive, but instead postponed it or gave it detours, in its ultimate goal to return to the inanimate. Taking this idea from Freud, Lacan conceived of the death drive not as a drive towards returning to the inanimate, but instead another kind of repetition, occurring within the repetition of the instincts of self-preservation. A repetition within repetition, repetition of satisfaction accidentally created within the repetition of self-preservation. This thought does not fully depart from Freud. In his 3 essays on the theory of sexuality, he sees sexuality as a surplus satisfaction or excitation that occurs in the satisfaction of different organic functions. The surplus created here is an internal cause of tension, and the drive coming from this surplus does not attempt to annihilate or remove this tension, but instead repeat it. This surplus satisfaction is not a satisfaction derived from fulfilling a need. It does not remove some tension through appeasement, but instead generates further satisfaction or excitation. This repetition of surplus satisfaction goes against the pleasure principle, as its goal is the opposite of lowering tension. Here we can see that a surplus satisfaction is created within the attempt of satisfaction itself, a satisfaction created not from a need but instead from a tension. This brings us to Lacan's thesis on the satisfaction of drives. A drive is not satisfied by achieving its goal, but through failing to achieve its goal. As Lacan puts it, here we can clear up the mystery of that form that the drive may assume, and attaining its satisfaction without attaining its aim. This missing its goal, failing to obtain its aim, creates a tension and excitation, which, as we saw from Freud, can create its own satisfaction. Satisfaction not from removing tension, but by the generation of it. Dissatisfaction from failure for Lacan is only one aspect of the death drive existing within drives. The next aspect of the death drive for Lacan deals with the repetition of repeating this failure. So we see the death drive at work in drives, making them miss their aim, but there is a surplus satisfaction also at work here. The repeating of this failure itself creates a surplus satisfaction. It is a surplus because the initial satisfaction stems from the failure, which drives repeat, and the surplus stems from the repetition of repeating this failure itself. This surplus, however, is not the death drive, nor is the repetitive want for the aim that is being missed. The death drive is the fixation on repeating the repetition of a drive to fail in its aim. Žižek explains this as such. We have to be very precise here if we are not to miss Lacan's point, and thereby confuse desire and drive. Drive is not an infinite longing for the thing which gets fixated onto a partial object. Drive is this fixation itself, in which resides the death dimension of every drive. So now we can clearly see for Lacan, drives aim to fail in their goal, which brings them satisfaction. So each time a drive fails, satisfaction is gained, which this satisfaction is the death drive at work. The death drive then creates a surplus satisfaction by finding satisfaction in the repetition of repeating this failure. A satisfaction in surplus created from a repetition of repetition. This brings us to Slavoj Žižek. He takes us a step further by bringing the idea of truth and falsity into the dimension of the drive, though it is still very much in line with Lacan. He says the goal of the drive is false, stating, "The drive's goal, to read its object, is false. It masks its true aim, which is to reproduce its own circular movement by way of repeatedly missing its object." So here we can see the goal for the drive is never to obtain the object of desire, but instead its true aim is to fail so it can continue its circular movement around the object. This circular movement, this repetition itself, as we stated earlier, creates not less satisfaction because of constant failure, but instead creates a surplus satisfaction. Žižek continues saying, "The drive's repeated missing of its object does not simply compel us to be satisfied with a lesser enjoyment, but generates a surplus enjoyment of its own." Finally here, we see an answer to Freud's initial problem. Why do people repeat their trauma? Because firstly, a drive gains satisfaction from failure, and secondly, because there is a surplus satisfaction, or in Žižek's terms, surplus enjoyment created from the very repetition of failure itself. We continue this failure and repetition till we die, but it acts as if we never have an expiration date. It compels us to repeat to no end. Now we see the paradox of the Freudian death drive is therefore that it is Freud's name for its very opposite, for the way immortality appears within psychoanalysis, for an uncanny excess of life or an undead urge which persists beyond the biological cycle of life and death, of generation and corruption. If you made it this far, thanks for sticking around, toughen through it with me. This video was very difficult for me to get out. Learning this concept, I was bouncing between about 7 books, between Žižek, Zupančič, and Freud Lacan. It also took probably the most time I've ever spent on a video. And I'm really proud of how it turned out, and I hope that it helped with understanding this concept. It's very kind of confusing, especially if you jump into Lacan by himself. And I hope it kind of explained the way that this concept has changed over time from Freud to Lacan and then Žižek, even though Žižek and Lacan are basically in the exact same line. I want to thank everyone who supported me through this, either just told me they were excited to see the video, told me things to read, or big shout out to my girlfriend being willing to listen to me ramble on about the death drive for weeks on end. Yeah, I hope this helped, and I hope that you guys enjoyed this content, because as much as I do a lot of political stuff, I'm really into theory and philosophy and psychoanalysis, and I really want to be able to incorporate that into this channel. I don't plan on not doing politics or anything like that, but I want to be able to bring this dimension into the channel as well. And I hope that is something that all of you may get something from and enjoy. But overall, just thank you for watching. And I hope it was informative and helpful for you. And yeah, I think that's about it. So thanks, guys.